The opening sequence of episode 17 sees another return of Armin's narration, with it again implying a major turn in history. Here is just reframing what we've seen before to better fit the context of the larger war going on behind the scenes that we're still largely unaware of. Of course, Eren plugging the wall is a major win for Paradis, and despite the many lost soldiers, their counterattack can now begin in full swing. Though, as in any war, such an attack will of course be met with heavy resistance, which takes us right into the episode's title, The Female Titan. The implication here is pretty clear. As much as Erwin's scheme to lure out the moles up to this point seemed to be successful, they are still operating with incomplete information, and so their enemy would once again regain the upper hand as an entirely new variable gets thrown into the mix. That, of course, being a third Titan shifter on the enemy's side. Moving into the episode itself, the scenes we get here are super interesting in how they frame this upcoming mission. We hear that same heroic music we've heard in episodes past, of course signaling the triumph that this entire plan is in the first place. Both from Eren's point of view, with him reaching his dream of becoming a scout, as well as from the broader humanities, they are making history. Though what I think is the most interesting part here is what happens once the Titans show up, because that music never stops. Despite the struggle of the other scouts, we are told to look forward. We zoom out from the individual struggles we've seen thus far and focus on the much bigger picture. And so suddenly, the once terrifying Titans just become noise, which both speaks to us now being in an entirely different league alongside the scouts, as well as subtly framing that compared to what we're about to encounter, the Titans are indeed just noise. And as we hear Erwin's commands, the tone once again shifts into an even more macrocentric view, as we now totally zoom out to see the formation in practice. Like we already touched on last time, this just further separates the scouts from everyone we've seen thus far, because instead of some flashy ODM gear moves, we focus on the large-scale plan first and foremost. To an extent, individuals don't even really matter in this plan. What we're focusing now is the large-scale operation. And in the bigger story, with those drums of war once again ringing out, we of course now also know that all of this is no more than a smokescreen to what they're actually trying to achieve. And also in a meta sense, notice how we are given a handful of very explicit character locations, which, as per our ever-important Chekhov, would indicate that some of these might be worth keeping an eye on. Something that would be very much proven in just a moment. Though we then zoom out to see this ever so subtle hovering and floaty shot from a distance, almost as if to tell us Armin is being watched. And directly preceding that, we indeed cut to Armin, who too senses that something is off. And to hammer home that foreboding nature, we even see the obligatory murder of crows. In story, I think it's hard to say whether the implication is that Annie is actually watching them, as we never really get a sense of how much time passes here, and it could easily just be a cinematic way of conveying that impending sense of doom. But I mean, whatever the case, clearly as the viewer, we already at least on a subconscious level expect something to go wrong very soon. And as we cut to Sasha, that is exactly what we see, as her relay squad encounters an abnormal effectively right away. But note how even now, while the music is somewhat uneasy and climactic, it never gives off that sense of desperation we got in Trost. It's a battle theme, sure, but nothing about it implies that we're facing defeat or any immediate danger. But when you look back at the first time we encountered this sort of abnormal, the mission fell apart in mere minutes. Whereas here, even on an open field, while Sasha does obviously get spooked, we still remain largely calm and collected, and the mission just keeps on going. In the context of the bigger story, is just another reminder that we have had our training arc, we have had our trial by fire. And so now, we are both more experienced, as well as just a little more desensitized to the Titans. And like I briefly touched on before, it also continues subtly framing regular and now even abnormals as simply noise compared to what we're about to encounter, and more importantly, what the goal of this entire mission is in the first place. On initial viewing, this might have seemed as an expedition beyond the wall where survival is key. With the benefit of hindsight on the other hand, we clearly know that all of these subtle framing techniques are just hinting toward the fact that this mission is a mousetrap and we are anticipating a much bigger enemy. And speaking of anticipating larger enemies, like some that are maybe 60 meters tall, as we cut to Ness's group who has encountered another abnormal, we get some really interesting lines about effectiveness of the ODM gear. Effectively, he talks about how using the ODM gear on an open field is next to useless, as there is obviously no buildings or anything else to latch onto. First off, I think it's just a really cool note on world building, as it's sort of a natural inhibitor that just adds to the danger of venturing beyond the walls. Though secondly, it is another subtle hint as to what is truly going on here. Because yes, even if you have pieced together that this whole plan is about baiting someone out, you would still think that baiting out a shifter on an open field probably isn't an entirely sound idea, right? So, why is it that we are constantly pushing onward, almost as if we are trying to reach a certain location, and as far away from the walls as possible? Not to repeat myself 100 times throughout this video, keep this little question in mind. Though after downing the abnormal, for the first time in this episode, we cut to this prolonged silence. Even as another Titan appears on the horizon, the battle theme we had seen thus far with every encounter never starts. Instead, we hear this haunting and ever so subtly building tone which I can only describe as that biblical vibe in Diablo cinematics. But that background track is then sharply interrupted by another entirely new track as Annie just sprints right past them. And as Ness's squad charges in to take it down, without ever skipping a beat, they are swatted out of the sky as if they were nothing. And that dissonant piano just keeps on going and going until it reaches another peak and those signature lumbering footsteps ring out yet again as Annie begins her march. As per usual, both the sound design as well as purely narratively, I think the series absolutely nailed that 180 in tone. Just like with Reiner and Bertolt later in the series, we aren't even given any room to breathe or think or even register who this might be. She just runs up, annihilates the entire squad in a matter of seconds, and keeps on going. Though a smaller thing to note here, notice how Armin first says, "What is she?" but then corrects himself to, "No, what are they?" Clearly implying that this new enemy is still a part of that same force fighting against them. On the face of it, and especially with the benefit of hindsight, that seems like a super obvious detail. But I think it's important to keep in mind that a line like this was deliberately included to immediately tell you that, at least by Armin's judgment, this is not some rogue fighter, this is still the same enemy they've been fighting against. Whenever it comes to lines like these, I think it's always important to zoom out of the story a little and think about it from the point of view of the author. Why would this line be included? Is it simply to avoid people making 300 theories and losing focus on the bigger story? Or is it perhaps the complete opposite and meant to mislead? Personally, I think Isayama's writing is particularly strong in this aspect, and is exactly why I constantly mention good old Chekhov when talking about plot devices in the series. Bar maybe a few exceptions, everything is there for a very, very good reason. And so even lines like these serve a clear purpose of just telling you that, yes, this Titan might have come out of nowhere, but it is right there alongside the Armored and the Colossal. But okay, my meta ramblings aside, we then cut on over to the mid-cards, which just expand on the formation we're seeing. Considering how little of Erwin we had actually seen thus far, I think this was just there to continue building him up as the brains behind most of what the scouts do, with us explicitly being told that this formation was devised by him and it immediately also showed results with less soldiers dying beyond the walls. Returning to the field though, before we snap back to Armin, we see that the entirety of the right flank has been completely wiped out, and more importantly, that the Titans were apparently led by the female Titan, which of course begins to hint at her unique power. Though returning to Armin, we see him being blasted off the horse, and in classic Attack on Titan fashion, we get that uncomfortably long moment of silence where we just hear Armin's troubled breathing. But what I adore is what we see next. Because after Annie spares him, we get that signature sound effect that we occasionally hear in the series. I don't even know exactly how to describe it, but point is, it's not one you would expect to hear in this context, right? Armin almost got annihilated, but this was not a moment of brutality. It was almost oddly peaceful, in fact. For my fellow Resident Evil fans out there, it's almost like hearing that save rooms theme, because you know that for that brief moment, the horrors are over. And speaking of which, in story, this of course also begs the question of, why did she uncloak him and why did she spare him? Of course, we can now channel our inner Attack Titan and the answers are simple. But even on initial viewing, I don't think it was particularly hard to clock the somewhat dead blue eyes, the blonde hair, and someone who just so happens to have an odd connection with Armin. And clearly, pulling a character out of nowhere is like the biggest writing no-no. So if this is someone we would have seen already, there really aren't that many suspects left, right? Clearly, this is Annie. The only question now, of course, is, why is she doing this? But oh boy, after seeing their little arc in the first part of the final arc, this feels oddly sad but wholesome at the same time. At this point, I don't care what happens to Mikasa and Eren, and as long as Armin and Annie are happy, I am happy. This duo is like literally the only wholesome thing left in the show. Please, Isayama, don't make this little comment age poorly. And for those of you who have read the manga, please don't spoil me either. But of course, it's at this point where things become very, very interesting, because an all-out battle between Marley and Paradis now begins in full swing. We see Reiner ride up, asking whether Armin's fine and what happens. And almost right away, they get on their horses and start pursuing Annie's Titan. First off, the obvious. This is a case of Marley managing to pull one over on Erwin. Because while his plan of luring out the enemy was entirely sound and clearly worked, what he couldn't account for is a third Titan who is being fed information by an insider. Though number 2, note how when Armin says it's not abnormal, it's intelligence. Reiner is genuinely caught off guard, not because he is acting here, but because he genuinely does not know that Annie spared him. So in his mind, the only question now is, wait, why is he still alive and how much does he know? Has he figured it out already? And if you ask me, if Jean hadn't shown up here, well, I think Armin would have faced a very similar fate to Marco. But that then brings us to Erwin's big counter, and because every good video needs a narrative, I'll title these Erwin Smokescreen Parts 1 to however many there are. Keep in mind that this entire plan was set up with the bait of them going after Eren, right? So when Jean rides up and they catch up on what's going on with this new Titan, Armin begins to speculate that her uncloaking him back there was because she doesn't aim to kill right away. She appears to be looking for a certain person, proposing Eren as the obvious main candidate. And get ready for this because my guy Reiner casually says, Eren? He's in the right flank, the one she just passed through. And my dude, like, you just outed yourself. And notice Armin's reaction here, he is entirely caught off guard, which begs the question of, is he worried about Eren, or did he too just notice the discrepancy? Because Jean then adds that his plans were different, saying that Eren isn't in the right flank. And then Armin too confirms that his plans were yet another different version. So what we should be thinking here is, Reiner's plans said the right flank, and Annie's first target was the right flank. That's it, we've got him, Erwin's plan worked. And as if that wasn't enough, Armin then deduces that, wait, none of this makes sense. The safest position is the rear of the center, that is where he should be. And again, remember old Chekhov. Why did Armin deduce this now? Because the next thing we see is this conversation being interrupted and them catching up to Annie. Picking up on their first encounter, Armin of course tells them to wear the hoods, and so they all charge in. And the music here just seems so deliberate. Because we have that iconic colossal theme, but there is also that usual battle theme. It's not entirely bleak, it's not entirely upbeat, it's a war. Also, notice how we get the inner monologues of both Jean and Armin as they talk about trying to slow it down. But we don't hear Reiner for what I think are obvious reasons. His inner monologue right now is probably just, how do I tell her to move to the center squad? I think we've messed up. And another fun detail here is Armin saying, we're not killing it. When the time comes, maybe those two can, referring to Levi and Mikasa. This is super easy to forget, but as of right now, the fact that Levi too is an Ackerman is yet to be revealed. So I think all of these constant comparisons between the two are just subtly foreshadowing that. Though the actual confrontation sequence here is just perfect. Everything from the music suddenly picking up in full swing, to yet another excellent ODM gear scene as Jean flies around, it is all just so good. And what's also incredible here is what Armin pulls off. Because after he is blown off his horse, he yells out that he told him that he died in the right flank, yelling that she killed him, which immediately makes Annie freeze because for a brief moment, she thinks she messed up. Did she really accidentally kill Eren already? From Reiner's information, he should have been there. And now Armin yells out that she did in fact kill him? Could it really be true? But yet again, this is a war after all. So now it is time for the other side to make a move. And so, while Annie is frozen up, Reiner charges in supposedly to slice her nape right away. But he is immediately caught and supposedly squished, only for him to suddenly spring out of her hand, slicing off a few digits and landing like the legend that he is. First off, again, the obvious. If he, supposedly a normal human being, were to be seriously squished, he'd be toast, so clue numero 1. Either this is Titan generation, or he was never squished to begin with. In the same vein, as he lands, Annie's blood of course evaporates off of him. But even if he were to have been squished himself, clearly that too would just steam right off. Though what is the dead giveaway here is what happens after. Because 1, Annie literally never reacts to any of this. She just chills there for a second and just stares at her hands, almost as if. And number 2, literally right after this encounter, she just goes right around and suddenly begins running right toward Eren. Oh, you know, almost as if a certain someone just inscribed a message in her palm he got from his much smarter blonde friend. I mean, yeah, jokes aside, she came from the right flank, already outing the faulty information from Reiner. And now, she straight up acts on the intel Reiner just got from Armin and passed on to her. So at this point, we have already got 2 of our moles effectively figured out. But again, this is a back and forth. We've got a move from Marley, so it's Erwin's turn, right? And with that, let us jump right into episode 18, where the opening sequence is another cheeky case of reframing the events we've seen thus far as 2 very deliberate sides of a war. It seems obvious in hindsight, but on initial viewing, remember that the female Titan literally came out of the blue with no rhyme or reason. So when we open with Erwin's plan and how they talk about the certain positions, that is then interrupted by this deliberate subversion. That whole nature of these 2 sides just constantly trying to counteract one another just becomes so much more clear. Especially with Armin too noting in the previous episode that the female Titan, the Armored and the Colossal are likely in cahoots. As I've mentioned frankly too many times already, this whole reframing nature is of course a staple of the series going as far back as the very first episode. So with the conflict now really heating up, those 2 sides will just become more and more clear. As for the title of the episode, A Forest of Giant Trees, I think is too pretty self-explanatory. Because this is overanalyzing, of course I had to look into all kinds of trees and whether or not Ymir merging with the spine-looking thingy might have had some sort of effect on them. But no, not really. There are plenty of trees in the real world that eclipse even the 80-meter ones we see here. More on the trees later though. Moving into the episode itself, we open with a follow-up with Jean's trio and hear how Jean's horse ran off and doesn't seem to be coming back. First off, again, I think is just some really neat world building with how even something as silly as this is a death sentence. You survive the Titans, you survive even a Titan shifter, but without a horse, you are simply too slow to survive out here. Just like running out of gas back in Trost, it just re-establishes that sense of danger you might overlook on these luscious green hills. Because yes, even here, there is danger around every corner. And another thing to note, just like we've talked about with Jean before, I also really like how he clearly doesn't want to, but he does also begin asking himself, so what happens if the horse doesn't return? Do we draw straws? Do we leave Armin, who is already injured? Do we leave Reiner? He hates himself for even thinking about it. But realistically, those thoughts would crop up. So I just really like that they were being addressed here, even if moments later that is of course all figured out, with none other than Historia riding up with Jean's horse, because of course it's Historia. And this is also another very rare case of those typical anime things in early Attack on Titan, as we see all the boys thirst over her a little, saying she's a deity, an angel, and finally, I want to marry her. And while yes, obviously this is just a haha thirsty boys moment, in the context of the bigger story, she is kinda sorta their literal queen, right? I mean, obviously they don't know it yet, but you know, maybe she already has some of that queen energy and they just picked up on it, who knows? Jokes aside, as they all ride off, everyone is expecting a retreat, but instead, they see a green flare, simply meaning a change in course, not a retreat. We then jump on over to Levi's squad, who are told that the entirety of the right flank has been wiped out. And it's right after that a black smoke is fired off, signaling an abnormal. And here, I think it's important to once again note that no one aside from those who have clearly seen her know about the female Titan's existence. So while they might suspect foul play and that this is what Erwin's plan is about, right now, this is just an abnormal to them. Though speaking of the female Titan, we then jump on over to the squad that sent off the signals, engaging her in combat. And the animation here is also just top notch. This whole fly around ODM gear scene is really cool, and the almost JoJo moment of her suddenly jumping up is also a really cool one. But what I think is the absolute best part is the musical and tonal transition that happens here. We open the sequence with the soldiers all saying how they'll go for the weak spots, and the underlying music is this tense but still upbeat battle chant. Though just as they seemingly surround her, we cut to silence and she jumps. And suddenly, the music completely changes into a far darker theme. And they are just all swatted out of the way, one by one, with her even going as far as to just straight up toy with the soldier she caught. And then that horrifying image of her chasing down the final soldier of the squad and kicking him like 100 meters across the sky is like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't try to take her head on. And as one final act of brutality, we see another pair of soldiers also ride up to her. Only here, we don't even see anything. We simply hear these chilling bells ring out, almost as if to convey that she alone is now passing higher judgments. And with that, we get this Death Note-esque scene of her simply standing amidst the bodies as this biblical chanting begins. Though in the midst of what might be their darkest hour yet, we jump on over to a squad riding up to the forest. Which nicely leads us into the mid-cards talking about the forest of giant trees. First off, again, I think this is just some neat subtle world building, with this forest supposedly being a tourist attraction before Wall Maria fell. Though secondly, and much more importantly, why might we need a forest of specifically massive trees? Going as far as to specify that some of them are even 80 meters tall seems like an odd thing to add if this huge size wasn't relevant, huh? Well, if you were trying to bait out an enemy, one which is actually taller than your 50-meter walls, 80-meter trees which you can use for insane ODM gear maneuverability really seems nice, doesn't it? With Annie, obviously these massive trees turn out to be a little overkill, but keep in mind that even now, very few people know about the female Titan's existence. So originally, this plan is designed to trap the Colossal, the Armored, or both, not Annie. And with that, we jump on over to Erwin's squad, who too are now entering the forest. The others, on the other hand, are told to stay outside and take interceptory positions, with the goal of stopping anything or anyone who might enter, and the far more important thing that is conveniently left out, leave the forest. So in this case, Erwin's squad of strongest and most experienced fighters keep on going right into the mousetrap they have set up. Not only that, they are heading right into their own home turf where they have a major advantage with the ODM gear. And to top it all off, here there is very little room to disappear. Sure, they may try hiding somewhere in the forest, but sooner or later, they would have to come out. This isn't Shiganshina or Trost where they could simply slip into the walls in their human form. Even the illustration used here paints this forest as a small patch of woods surrounded by a field. Theoretically, there is no way out. Obviously, Erwin is still working with incomplete information. So if the Marley squad really wanted to go all out, I mean yeah, technically Bertolt could have just leveled this entire thing with his nuke. But based on what they know now, this plan is effectively foolproof. But of course, the others are still never let in on it. So as we jump on over to Jean, he once again questions just what exactly is going on here, and says that this entire whole mystery they're being led on is just frustrating. And once again, I love how Jean is just sort of your everyman here. He starts talking about how there are plenty of stories of certain leaders having mysterious stabs in their back when they turn out to be unfit to lead. But as Armin gets worried, he of course adds that, "Don't worry, I'm not going to do anything, I just need to vent." Realistically, if you were putting your life on the line, and you were just being led in circles even after encountering yet another absolutely history-changing event in the female Titan's appearance, I think it's perfectly normal to just be worked up about not being told what's going on. Keep in mind that in the 100 plus years of history they have, the Colossal and Armored were an absolute first that quite literally changed the course of history. And now, yet another one of these shifters appears. More has happened in the space of 5 years than in the past 100. I mean, sure, his rational brain understands that there must be an ulterior motive and that there is something far bigger going on here. But he himself clearly knows that I am not the bad guy here. Though when Jean asks Armin what he thinks about this whole thing, he too says that he really doesn't understand. And while he does speculate the goal here, he can't really piece together the full plan just yet. By now, if they know about the female Titan, Erwin surely must have gotten the information too. So is the plan really to confront her head on? We then jump on over to Levi and Eren, where Eren too just asked for at least some sort of pointer as to what is going on here. First off, Levi also knows the trees, telling Eren to use his unremarkable brain to look around and think how they might be useful. Though secondly, and much more importantly, we see that even on the Levi squad, no one here, aside from Levi himself that is still fully aware of what is actually happening. Which would later beg the chilling question of, if Erwin is so cautious so as to only let a handful of people in on the plan, is he anticipating an even further retaliation from whoever is trying to wipe out Paradis? He constructed all the plans, so the sudden heel turn from attacking the right flank and switching right to the center should certainly raise suspicion as to which squad was given a certain piece of faulty information, right? Well, there is a very good reason why Reiner and Bertolt would later be split off from Annie. Though some of these more immediate thoughts of the scouts would be covered in the next couple of episodes, so we'll leave that for then. Long story short, clearly these thoughts are already on everyone's minds here. This level of secrecy is largely unprecedented even for Erwin. Cutting back to Armin, he has gone through the method of elimination and arrived at only one very ominous conclusion. Erwin does indeed plan to confront the female Titan here and now. And so, they are effectively an alarm system that keeps things from both leaving the forest as well as entering. Normal Titans will be drawn to them, meaning that no extra enemies will pour into the forest as they're confronting the shifter. Not only that, the trees also offer some pretty decent protection, as no normal Titan would be just able to suddenly yoink them from the trees. Which, of course, also allows the remaining forces to recharge a little in case anything goes wrong. We would of course see some of the Titans begin to climb trees and whatnot, but it's not really something that'll catch you off guard. And so, with the alarm system set and the plan laid out, we return to the Levi squad where a black smoke signal is fired off. And as Levi says, "Draw your blades, it'll happen any moment," the music once again does a complete 180, as we swap from those uneasy strings to this chilling chanting as a scout flies through the woods only to be swatted out of the way like a fly. And now that booming, scratchy horror music kicks in, painting what is almost a boss encounter as they simply try to outrun this new, entirely unknown enemy. And in that classic thriller-like climax, the music just keeps on going up and down, up and down. And the absolute best part here, Eren gets a little too comfortable, thinking that, oh, you messed up, you're chasing the best Titan Slayers humanity has to offer. But when he turns around, he is met with a very chilling realization, because Levi does not give any command. They simply keep on moving. And when he does speak, it is not a battle command. Rather, he just tells them to cover their ears as he fires off an acoustic round. And on that very ambiguous and admittedly cliffhangery note, those are episodes 17 and 18. Another couple of great ones with a very thrilling lead up to the entrapment of the female Titan, so the next couple covering the climax of Erwin's mission should also be an absolute blast. Seems kind of wild to me how close we are to wrapping up the first season already, but this last stretch of episodes should be an absolute ton of fun to cover. So with that, I hope to see you back as we continue overanalyzing Attack on Titan. And that's the video. I've said it a million times and I'll say it again, it is still absolutely wild to me how many times the show just blatantly showed us who the true enemies are. Though yeah, I am very excited to get into the climax of this arc. And with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcomes to the newest members of the team: Malcolm, Timmy Kobo, Real Jed, Relucci, and Jordan last name. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!